Racism, classism, sexism, xenophobia. If you think about it, all of them are exacerbated by scarcity. When someone thinks of an other group, a group they think of as other, and they think about competing with them, and that if they don't compete well, they're going to have less, and that other group is going to have more, that would drive all of those words that I just mentioned. Some men, as an example, especially when women first started to enter the workforce, have felt as though women in the workforce would maybe drive their wages lower. More laborers competing in the same labor market can drive the price of their labor down. And that actually is possible, although it doesn't work that way in our economy. Because of technology, because of expansion, because of innovation, our economy is not a zero-sum game. So extra workers doesn't necessarily have to drive the price of labor down. If it were a zero-sum game, that would be different. Similarly, in the past, more blacks, more Chinese people, more Hispanic people entering the workforce might make people think that their wages would go down as a result. And again, in our economy, that isn't actually true. It's not a zero-sum game. Our production actually is enhanced by having all the extra people. And the potential rewards also go up, but the oligarchs keep snatching those away from us. And that's where the oligarchs come in and their narrative management machine. They want us to blame each other. They want us to mistrust each other. So with racism, classism, sexism, and xenophobia, scarcity makes us fear each other. And that's why Joe Biden likes scarcity. That's why Joe Biden likes austerity. That's why the machine he works for likes those things. It makes it easy to control us when we blame each other. Shitlibs, for example, lose their shit when you start talking about aligning with racists. And of course it's bad to be racist, but people don't always think about the underlying causes. The distrust that happens with racism is exacerbated by scarcity. Removing the scarcity can help people work together, and it can lead to them trusting each other. And then there's no more racism. But when shitlibs look at what they would call a basket of deplorables, they see racism as the star on the belly of the star-bellied Sneetch, and they see it as unchangeable. Look at all these Trump-supporting racist bigots. They're incorrigible, they're irredeemable, and there's no point, there's no possibility of ever thinking together with them. We will always mistrust them. We will always look down on them. And that puts us right where our masters want us. And when some of the shitlib pundits lose their shit, this is the result. Nathan Robinson is a shitlib. Yes, he loves Bernie Sanders, but he's still on the wrong side of the class divide. People in the comfy suburbs distrust people who don't live there, regardless of what color they are. And so their ism is just as bad as the racism they disavow. And in fact, they're just as racist, it's just cloaked. So the point of today's show is to tackle the idea that racists and classists are fundamentally different from each other and can never unite. Shitlibs are classists and racists, and Trump supporters, a lot of them, are racist and perhaps also classist. They're wannabe classists. The thing to figure out is that we have a common enemy, and it isn't each other. And the shitlib pundits don't want us to figure this out. Last summer, Nathan Robinson reviewed Crystal Ball's and Sagar Enjeti's book, A Populist's Guide to 2020. He criticized the authors for overstating the compatibility of left and right-wing populism, stating that right-wing populism is more or less just fascism, and we've talked about that word a lot, so I'm not going to go back to that right now, and that the left should confront supposed right-wing populists rather than court them and seek common ground with them. So yes, I'm saying Nathan Robinson is a classist, and that's obvious. But if he's not racist, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's better than the people he's deploring. Back to Keaton. This sparked a debate on the left, which was recently revived when Jimmy Dore did a video on a Boogaloo Boys member named Magnus Panvidya, who, despite his alignment with the ostensibly far-right group, seemed to speak fondly of Antifa and Black Lives Matter and lamented the corporate takeover of the U.S. government. Jimmy later interviewed Magnus on his show, a move criticized by subsequent guest Jerry White, a socialist organizer who appeared on the program moments after Magnus's segment ended. I'm gonna guess if he objected that Jerry White is a shitlib. Some on the left agree with Robinson and White that seeking partnership with right-wing populists is a non-starter, while others feel left and right populists ought to engage each other and seek common ground on certain issues, particularly economic issues. Which side of the debate one finds themselves on depends to a large extent on their perception of class struggle. Those who interpret it as a top versus bottom conflict would be more inclined to partner with those of a different political ideology, feeling their common class interests transcend their political differences. To those for whom ideological divides supersede class positions, such a partnership is deemed both unfeasible and undesirable, and they would look down their noses if presented with this idea and make snarky, condescending comments. While leftists' trepidation on this question is understandable, those in the latter camp who dismiss and disparage the idea of constructive left-right populist dialogue are badly misguided in their assessment. I was hoping you were going to call them out soon, Keaton. First, we as leftists should establish that in order to grow our power and influence, we have to grow our numbers. He then goes on to say that we just aren't as popular as some of us think we are. There aren't as many of us as we'd like to think, and we can't take over the country with the numbers that we have now, so we need more people. I hope that summary does the next few paragraphs justice. Skipping ahead, once we accept that we aren't yet popular enough, we must ask ourselves to whom we can appeal in order to boost our popularity. This is where questions of top versus bottom and left versus right become rather messy. Because the problem is this: the closer you get to the political center, the less of a top versus bottom analysis you'll find. Yeah, the people in the center don't want to talk about that. It makes them very uncomfortable. I'll also remind us that we've said that right and left aren't what we think they are. Left means for the people, right means for the king. So right populists aren't really right populists by that definition. If you're curious about that, do a little research into the French Revolution. Centrist Democrats and Republicans both subscribe to a neoliberal economic philosophy. Say that again, Keaton. Centrist Democrats and Republicans both subscribe to a neoliberal economic philosophy. There's no point in differentiating Ronald Reagan enthusiasts from Bill Clinton enthusiasts, the very purpose of which is to erase class consciousness from political discourse. Therefore, there is no support for class struggle campaigns to be extracted from establishment-adjacent centrist liberals or conservatives. Good point. Populist right-wingers might disagree. Now let's make sure we know that populist means left-wing, not right-wing, but okay. Populist right-wingers might disagree with leftists ideologically, and that's mostly on social issues that are exacerbated, as I said earlier, by scarcity. But there is at least a common acknowledgement of the permanent power imbalance between elite institutions, both private and public, and ordinary people. That's where populists agree. Centrists deny the existence of such a thing not because they don't believe it, but because their political ideology explicitly demands that they deny it. I don't know about you, but the shitlibs on my Facebook page are denying it right and left. They get so upset with me when I keep coming back to the class struggle. Leftists, true leftists, who still believe that centrist liberals are persuadable on this point are sorely mistaken. We're never going to win the shitlibs over and let them talk fairly and honestly about economic injustice. Liberals' aversion to class politics is not an innocent misunderstanding. Say that again, Keaton. Liberals' aversion to class politics is not an innocent misunderstanding that can be rectified through persuasion. It is part and parcel of their core belief system as reflected in their political rhetoric, the media they consume, and the candidates they support. And for that reason, it's fair for critics of shitlibs to say that they are just as racist as anyone else, because in this case, in every case, classism and racism really amount to the same thing. Until we can end redlining, until we can end all of the systemic racism in our system, they're going to be equivalent. That's the most insidious aspect of Joe Biden's racism, is the classism underneath it. The last sentence in this paragraph is a little confusing, but I'm going to read it anyway. To them, class politics is classism. It's a form of prejudice which, like all other forms of prejudice, undermines the market-based meritocracy which they aspire to perfect. Shitlibs want to pretend that the market is fair and supersedes all kinds of isms like classism and racism. For me to make sense of that sentence, I have to say that they're hiding their isms underneath the market. They're pretending that the market covers all of those isms. And it also gives cover for the oligarchs to take away from the poor. They act like it's fair, that they had the best ideas, the most drive, they deserve their place in the sun. And so this religious fervor with which they look at the market and how it works is a way to cover their own isms. And now we turn to Chicago, 1969, when Black Panthers aligned with Confederate-flag-wielding working-class whites. And based on what we've already said today, we know that the shitlibs are going to be against this sort of thing. This kind of alignment is going to cause them to panic. In the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump won the white vote across all demographics except for college-educated white women. He did especially well among working-class white voters. 67% of whites without a college degree voted for him. Some post-election analysis marveled at how the white working class could vote against its own interests by supporting a billionaire businessman who is likely to support policies that cut taxes for the rich and weaken the country's social safety net. Since the New Deal, the Democratic Party has been seen as the party of working people, while Republicans were considered the party of the elites. And that, dear viewers and listeners, is where right-wing and left-wing makes sense. Left-wing is for the people, right-wing is for the king, or in this case, the elites. Donald Trump was able to flip this narrative to his advantage. Election 2016 balkanized issues and made it seem impossible to work on racism, sexism, poverty, and economic issues all at once. A core question moving forward for social justice advocates and the Democratic Party is, how can they move beyond identity politics and attract working-class voters of all races, building stronger coalitions among disparate groups? And as I've said earlier, dear viewers and listeners, if you put that into the context of condescension and snarkiness, it's never going to happen. And that condescension and snarkiness has been programmed, has been beaten into us through the propaganda of mainstream media. They want us to be snarky and condescending because it makes such a coalition among disparate groups impossible. One place to look for inspiration and instruction might be 1960s social movements that understood the power of alliances across identities and issues. During this period, a radical coalition formed that might seem impossible today. And the reason it might seem impossible today is because the elites, through their media, have made it impossible. Their propaganda machine has been fighting this very thing for all these years since the 1960s. That was me, if you couldn't tell. A group of migrant Southerners and working-class white activists called the Young Patriots joined forces with the Black Panthers in Chicago to fight systemic class oppression. And that's where Dr. Martin Luther King was going before he was murdered. At the end of his life, he agreed with Malcolm X about this, and that's why poor people's marches were started, and they were very threatening to the CIA. So how did this alliance form, and how can its lessons be applied to today's political moment? An unlikely alliance. In the post-civil rights era, a militant Black Power movement emerged with the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense forming in 1966. Inspired by Malcolm X and other international black thought leaders, the group embraced armed struggle as a potential tool against organized racial oppression, a radical break from the philosophy of nonviolent protest. A large faction of the group developed in Chicago, where one of the party leaders was a young man named Fred Hampton. Chicago in the 1960s was a brutal place for poor people. Black, brown, and white people all dealt with poverty, unemployment, police violence, substandard housing, inadequate schools, and a lack of social services. Ethnic and racial groups each created their own social service and activist networks to combat every kind of oppression. One was the Young Patriot Organization, YPO, which was based in Hillbilly Harlem, an uptown neighborhood of Chicago populated by displaced white Southerners. Many YPO members were racist, and they flaunted controversial symbols associated with Southern pride, such as the Confederate flag. But like blacks and Latinos, the white Young Patriots and their families experienced discrimination in Chicago. In their case, it was because they were poor and from the South. In his short time as a Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton wanted to advance the group's goals by forming a rainbow coalition of working class and poor people of all races. And if you remember Jesse Jackson, that's what he was talking about. Former members of the Chicago Panthers and YPO tell different versions of the same story of how the groups connected. Each attended the other's organizing meetings and decided to work together on their common issues. Over time, the Black Panthers learned to tolerate Confederate flags as intransigent signs for rebellion. Their only stipulation was that the white young patriots denounce racism. This is the cool part of this story. Eventually, young patriots rejected their deeply embedded ideas of white supremacy and even the Confederate flag as they realized how much they had in common with the Black Panthers and Latino young lords. Assumed to be natural enemies, these groups united in their calls for economic justice. Ding, ding, ding! In the August 9, 1969 issue of the Black Panther newspaper, the party's chief of staff, David Hilliard, admiringly called the Young Patriots the only revolutionaries we respect that ever came out of the mother country. Recalling his work with the YPO, former Black Panther Bobby Lee explained that the Rainbow Coalition was just a code word for class struggle. And that's why, dear viewers and listeners, I was calling out the leftists when they were critical of Trump supporters storming the Capitol. The Capitol needs to be stormed. If all the people who understand that the Capitol needs to be stormed storm it together, we're going to get somewhere. And this may be a stretch for some of you, but I really believe that Malcolm X would have embraced that idea, especially in light of this transformation where they gave up their open bigotry and they gave up their Confederate flag. And my belief is that healing economic injustice could lead to this sort of redemption all across the world. In the end, the Illinois Panthers brought together various elements of the black community: Confederate flag-waving Southern white migrants, young patriots, Puerto Ricans, young lords, poor white ethnic groups, Rising Up Angry, Join Community Union, and the Intercommunal Survival Committee, students, and the women's movement. The disparate groups under the coalition's umbrella pooled resources and shared strategies for providing community services and aid that the government and private sector would not. Initiatives included health clinics, feeding homeless and hungry people, and legal advice for those dealing with unethical landlords and police brutality. All of this makes sense, dear viewers and listeners, but there has been a concerted effort by the mainstream media and their oligarch masters to keep this kind of uniting from happening, and the way they've done it is racial divides. We've been brainwashed into thinking that we can't work together. In 2016, a stark racial divide is exposed. Almost 50 years after the original Rainbow Coalition, the U.S. electorate remains divided along racial lines. Even though Donald Trump asked black Americans, "What do you have to lose?" by voting for him and abandoning the Democratic Party, it didn't work. Only 8% of black voters and 28% of Latino and 27% of Asian voters cast ballots for Trump. Blacks and Latinos are well represented in the working class, and people of color will become the majority in the working class in 2032. Much 2016 post-election attention has focused on working-class white voters who have been characterized as forgotten and angry for being left out of the economic recovery. Yet African Americans have been far worse off. Since the 2007 recession, the unemployment rate of African Americans is nearly double that of Hispanics and more than twice that of whites. Hillary Clinton was the candidate who collected the most diverse voter base. The 2016 Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia looked like the Rainbow Coalition redux, and she was expected to win the election. However, that visual hid racism's residual and deeply entrenched place in U.S. society. One of the lessons of the 2016 election is that the country is not as advanced in its work on ending racism and discrimination as most would like to believe. Donald Trump did not have to do much to capitalize on this. And the reason, dear viewers and listeners, it was there to capitalize on is because of the media. They have made the racial divide worse since the 1960s, and this has been done on purpose. The Rainbow Coalition members in 1960s Chicago understood how difficult it is to build coalitions across identities. Former Black Panther Bobby Lee recalled working with the Young Patriots. It wasn't easy to build an alliance. I advised them on how to set up Serve the People programs, free breakfasts, people's health clinics, all that. I had to run with those cats, break bread with them, hang out at the pool hall. I had to lay down on their couch in their neighborhood. Then I had to invite them into mine. That was how the Rainbow Coalition was built, real slow. The coalition, bringing together seemingly polar opposite Black Panthers and Young Patriots, showed that real interactions allow people to understand that their struggles are not essentially different. Donald Trump probably was sincere when he invited African Americans to join his movement. He simply didn't realize that a glib invitation would not produce the same results as real coalition building over a period of time. And this is where I'll jump in and say, this is why we have to absolutely abandon the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party will always be led by shitlibs who don't want this kind of union. If the Republicans figure it out first, they're going to kick everyone's asses. If the Republican Party becomes the populist party, then it's all over for the Democrats. And I've already said that until we dismantle the Democratic Party, we're never going to have a chance of dismantling the corporatists in the Republican Party. But I'm down with this movement, this populism that would dismantle the corporatists and then both parties. This is about guillotines. And the military intelligence police complex understands this very well. The only people between us and the people who deserve guillotines are these watchdogs, the military and the police. And if you remember yesterday's show, the watchdogs are susceptible to being brought into this movement. They're not the elites. The military draws most of its numbers from the bottom half of the economy, and the police not that much higher. The military and the police are regular working class people, and they're susceptible to this movement for that reason. And without them standing in between us and the rich assholes are in big trouble. I didn't mention this up top, but Colette Gator is the author, Associate Professor, Department of Art and Design, University of Delaware. So I will give Colette the last word, but I want to say this first. We need to build this coalition outside of either party, and especially outside of the Democratic Party. All dreams die in the Democratic Party, and they are very well positioned to keep this movement from ever happening. They've been working strongly against this since the 1960s. So it ain't gonna happen with the Democrats. And now Colette's last piece of advice. The lesson to learn from studying 1960s social movements is that lasting change toward economic and racial justice will probably be built brick by brick, person to person, and real slow.